Now, another major part of the soundscape is going to be Foley. Now, what is Foley? Foley is basically a process named after Jack Foley, who invented it. Now, later on, we're going to do an entire session on Foley, so I'm not going to go too in depth now. I just need you to know what Foley is. And Foley is simply the act of mimicking an action on screen for the interaction of a character with objects. So if a character picks up something and puts it down again, that's going to make a noise, and so we record that by watching the action on screen, mimicking the action with the appropriate sound making object. So in this instance, what we would be spotting for the Foley artist is what Harrison Ford's character here is doing with this newspaper. Now you can see that all he's done so far is just sit and not done much, but that newspaper might be making a noise. It's not really moving much right now, so we can kind of ignore it. But as we come to here, you can see he scrunches it up and starts to move with it. He puts it above his head, which means that there's going to be interaction with rain there. His raincoat is also going to be moving, and as he comes in to shelter, he shakes out the newspaper and he dumps it down. Now all of those things are going to be sounds that the Foley artist is going to reproduce in the Foley studio. You see this in synchronization with the picture. That is going to require a newspaper falling on a surface in exactly the same way that the newspaper is going to require a sound associated with it being scrunched up. This is what the Foley artist is for. These are the sorts of sounds that we're going to want to hear. They're the character interactions with objects, and that's what Foley is for. And it will be often the sound of not only what they're interacting with in terms of objects, but the clothes that they're wearing, and it will also be stepping. Now, we've done a lot of footsteps in terms of foot waller, but where the Foley artist comes in is a Foley artist will actually mimic 1, 2, 3 footsteps right there, and we're going to want to hear those. So those are absolutely synchronous sounds. We're going to want to hear every footstep and every movement of that character sitting above the waller and the ambience and everything else, because that is where the audience's attention is to be drawn audibly. So the Foley artist is going to want to know what sound do I need to make and where do I need to make it, and this is where Foley comes in. We want to see the interaction with objects and clothes and footstepping and all the movements associated with a character where they touch or scratch or move any other material that we can see. The next thing I want to talk to you about is ADR. Now, Foley and ADR often go hand in hand because they're a very similar process. The difference is that ADR, which means automatic dialogue replacement, or more recently, additional dialogue recording, is simply where an actor will go into the studio, stand in front of a microphone, and watch their own performance on screen and lip sync their dialogue to what they're seeing. The reason for this is usually just to get either a cleaner recording because the recording wasn't very good on set, or it was a long shot and the camera was very far away and they couldn't get a decent recording from the actor's actual performance. So the actor will watch themselves on screen and then lip sync their dialogue back. So they'll have the script and they'll be watching their own lips move, and then they'll be copying and lip syncing to themselves to get a better recording or a different recording. Now, famously, Marlon Brando loved ADR so much. He loved sitting in the studio in his underwear in front of a microphone watching himself. And he liked this process so much that on set, he would deliberately mumble his lines so that they had to be ADR'd later. It's funny, some people love it, some people hate doing it, but it's important. It's a very important part of making a film because there's always going to be a moment where the dialogue isn't clear enough and you've got to do, you've got to do pickups. You've got to get the actor in just to pick up a few lines and re-record them. Now, sometimes a movie is 100% ADR, where all of the dialogue has been recorded as a lip sync. Now, this can be done for various reasons. It also saves a lot of time. You don't have to get perfect recordings on set, or sometimes it's just so you can have the control of inflection. It's just so an actor could do the same take, lip syncing to themselves, but can change the timbre of their voice, or just do it in slightly different ways. It will always be the same rhythm because it will have to sync up to their lips moving, but they can do so many different things with changing the way that they say things that some directors choose to do all of their dialogue as ADR. ADR tracks will usually be different to the main dialogue track. You'll have what was recorded. It's called production dialogue. So any production recorded dialogue will be what was recorded on the day. So you'll have production dialogue and then you'll have ADR. And there'll be two separate tracks that run alongside each other, and the ADR will kick in where the production sound drops off. Okay, so let's look briefly at the original sound for this clip, and we're just going to talk about ADR. There's a little bit of dialogue, there's not much at all, but all of it will have been ADR. And what I mean by that is,
a new life awaits you in the off-world colony. The chance to begin again in a golden land of opportunity and adventure.
Now that is just a piece of audio that's been recorded and then played over the top. It doesn't strictly fall into the ADR category because we're not lip syncing, we're not looping. Looping is another word for ADR. It just simply means that you're watching your vocal on a loop and you're doing it several times to try and lip sync. But moving on. Now right there, that's a piece of ADR. That is a piece of dialogue that has been lip synced. Let's go back. That's not production dialogue. That is something that's been recorded over the top. That's been looped as an ADR track. And that's what we're talking about. But we don't need to go into this. We're going to go into this much more later on. I just wanted to give you an example of where in this clip you might find a bit of recorded dialogue and a bit of ADR dialogue. Let's talk a little bit about sound effects. Now, we're going to do a session on sound effects and creating sound by effects. Now, what we mean by that is sound effects are sounds that usually, for me, I think of sound effects as something that is unnatural. It's not like Foley, where, you know, it's an object that you pick up and put down and we know what the sound is. It's a designed sound that doesn't exist in the natural world. So in sci-fi, it's really obvious, you know, it's a lightsaber, or it's, you know, a TIE fighter, or it's, you know, the sound of being beamed up from a planet. These are unnatural sound, they're designed sounds, and so I like to think of those sorts of things as sound effects, whereas Foley is natural sound. It's very much something that you do to mimic the natural sound of things being interacted with. As far as sound effects goes, this is a perfect moment. Now, let's just listen to this without any sound. This is a perfect example of where you might design a sound. Now, the sound of this machine, this vehicle, this blimp right here, this is where you might want to design a sound. This is where you're going to have something that's unnatural, something that has a sort of a sci-fi feel to it. Now, as we know, I used the sound of a accelerating bus just to kind of give it some sort of sense of presence. But this would be an area where we'd really want to design a sound. What does that object look like? What does that object sound like? And that would be a case for some serious sound effects to try and kind of give it an otherworldly, an unknown sound, an unnatural sound that we can design and take some time over. The next one is quiet and silence. Now, sound designers know that there's no such thing as silence. There's only relative quiet. There's something loud and then there's the relatively quiet afterwards, right? You can only have quiet if you've established what loud is. So we say silence because we know it doesn't really exist. You can choose your silence. The bit of silence between two tracks on a vinyl record is anything but silent, right? It's got crackle, pops, it's got a kind of it could have like a dusty, scratchy sound, but there's no music playing, so you think, oh, well, relative to the music that was playing, it's now gone silent. But of course it isn't silent. There's a massive amount of noise that comes out of it. We get to choose what our relative quiet and what our silence sounds like. And that's very powerful and certainly worth considering in your ambient soundtrack. Okay, so just to recap then, we've gone through the different layers of building up an ambient soundtrack. We started with natural sounds and we found rain and steam. Then we have the cultural sounds, the kitchen sounds, the sense of placement. That also included some diegetic music. We have the mechanical sounds of the generator. We have the signal sounds of the siren in the background. And then we have the human sounds, the foot walla, the vocal walla, the crowd noise. Then we have accent sounds, things that are synchronous, things that we need to hear that are in sync with the picture. And for that, we have the dragon sign, we have the blimp that we might later want to do some proper sound effects for. And we also have the umbrella sound. So where the rain sound, the general sound of rain, starts to become a lot more focused with the camera and how we're moving through it. The sound of the rain needs to be changed and accented to fit what it is that we're seeing. And so let's listen through to what we've added and see where this scene ends up, what we've ended up with simply by chunking it down and adding the building blocks to what it is that we can see based on the workflow of going through ambient sound as I have explained it. Okay, so that's our ambient sounds with our accent sounds, and it sounds pretty convincing. I like that. I think that that's pretty good. Given that we just literally are just adding the sound that we see, without any kind of messing around with EQ and minimal volume changes, I think that's pretty convincing. Let's leave it there, and I'll see you for the next one.